Habur Crucible 8, The Radar Trick. As with previous chapters, everything described in this story is entirely true.
The love I once knew had vanished, and with it, time lost its meaning. In the trenches, days bled into weeks, and weeks into months. The calendar became a useless scrap of paper. Life felt frozen on either side of the barbed wire, trapped in a cycle of waiting that never broke. We were stationed right on the border, with only the Habur River separating us from a foreign land. The water moved sluggishly, a dark ribbon cutting through the earth, indifferent to the men watching it from the mud. I spent hours staring at the opposite bank, tracing the silhouettes of trees that never seemed to change. The cold here was not just a temperature, it was a weight that settled into the bone, making every movement feel deliberate and slow. We existed in a state of suspended animation, where the only thing that grew was the silence. The river was the line, the finality, the edge of everything I understood. Beyond it lay a landscape that felt like a different world. Every night, the river mist rose to meet us, blurring the distinction between the land we held and the void. The border was never a fixed line. It was a porous membrane that changed texture when the sun went down. By day, the Peshmerga were ghosts of civility, conducting brief, predictable patrols that served as a thin veil for their true purpose. They moved with a practiced ease, their eyes scanning our positions, measuring our response times. We watched them through binoculars, tracking their movements until they withdrew back into the shadows of the hills. But when the light failed, the atmosphere curdled. The silence of the night was not empty. It was heavy with intent. We knew the routes they favored. We knew the weight of the cargo they carried under the cover of darkness. Smuggled weapons, crates of ammunition, and supplies destined for the interior. These were the invisible currents flowing across the border. Every rustle in the brush, every shift in the wind, felt like a deliberate probe against our defenses. We stood in the dark, listening to the silence, waiting for it to break. That night, the sky was a void. No moon, no stars, just a wall of absolute black pressing against the glass of our cabin. The air inside was stale, smelling of ozone and cooling electronics. I sat at the desk, eyes heavy, watching the rhythmic pulse of the monitor. Then, the silence shattered. The radar operator leaned forward, his chair screeching against the floorboards as he slammed a finger onto the console. "Commander, movement!" His voice was sharp, cutting through the stillness like a blade. I didn't hesitate. I pushed off the wall and leaned over his shoulder, my face inches from the screen. A cluster of white dots flickered against the dark grid, pulsing with a steady, unnatural rhythm. They were moving fast, cutting a path through the terrain from the direction of Zako. I squinted, tracking the trajectory. They were numerous, a dense swarm of signatures that defied the natural patterns of the landscape. "Smugglers," I muttered, the word tasting like iron. The fatigue vanished, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. I grabbed the radio handset. I keyed the radio, bracing for the usual dismissal from the Habur gendarmerie. I laid out the coordinates, expecting the standard bureaucratic delay. Instead, the response was immediate and clipped. "I am coming myself," the captain said. The line went dead. An hour later, the door to our cabin opened without a sound. The captain entered, followed by his men, their movements precise. They did not speak. They simply occupied the space, their presence tightening the air in the room. We moved to the radar console, crowding around the glowing screen. It watched the darkness like a hawk, a singular, unblinking eye. On the display, 15 distinct signatures had reached the borderline. They stopped. They held their positions, a cluster of white dots. "Any movement on our side?" the captain asked, his voice barely a whisper. "None yet, sir," I replied, my eyes locked on the screen. The signatures remained static, waiting for a signal. We stood in the dim light, breath held, watching the borderline. The silence was absolute. Minutes stretched thin, each one a heavy weight against the silence of the cabin. We watched the static borderline, waiting for the first sign of a breach. Then, the radar operator stiffened. "Commander, a group is coming from the Gurumlu direction." We scrambled outside, eyes straining against the absolute black, but the night offered nothing but cold air and shadow. We retreated to the screen. "Distance?" the captain asked, his voice steady. 6 kilometers, the operator replied. "How many?" 10, maybe 12. "They have pack mules." The captain leaned over the console, his finger tracing the terrain map. He did not look at us. He looked at the geometry of the trap. "They will meet at 3, load by 4 and move by 5, he calculated, his tone devoid of doubt. "If we strike at the border, they will scatter into the dark and escape, but inside, they will be ours." He looked at me, his expression unreadable. He handed me the radio handset. "Speak only if I ask. No names, no locations. We are being monitored." The plan was set. The cabin felt smaller as the hour passed. Outside, the world was a void, but inside, the screen told a story of inevitable collision. I watched the 2 clusters of white dots, one from the border, one from Gurumlu, crawling toward the same coordinate. My pulse thudded against my ribs, a steady, frantic rhythm that matched the sweep of the radar arm. The captain stood motionless, his gaze fixed on the convergence point. Then, the dots touched. They merged into a single dense mass on the display, people, mules, and cargo becoming one indistinguishable shape. The separation was gone. The distance had vanished. My heart hammered against my chest, a physical ache of anticipation. This was no longer a matter of tracking movement or reporting coordinates. The surveillance had dissolved. It had transformed into something colder, sharper, and final. A hunt. The captain did not blink. He watched the merged signature begin to shift, moving steadily toward our side of the line. The trap was closed. The hunt had begun. The merged cluster on the screen finally fractured. The dots split, with the smugglers turning decisively toward our side of the border. The captain's hand hovered over my shoulder, his fingers tight against the console. He nodded once. I took the radio handset, the plastic cold and slick against my palm. I keyed the transmitter, the burst of static cutting through the silence. Atmaka 1, I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline. "Go ahead," the voice crackled back from the dark. I looked at the captain, then back to the screen where the dots were moving deeper into our territory. "The ambulance has picked up the patient," I relayed. "Where to?" the voice demanded. "Martin State Hospital," I replied. A brief, sharp silence followed on the line. Then, a single, final word. Understood. I released the button. The cabin went deathly quiet. Outside, the absolute darkness seemed to hold its breath. Somewhere out there, the hidden units were moving. The trap was no longer a plan, it was an active, unfolding reality. We waited, eyes locked on the screen. The night finally surrendered to a thin gray light. We stepped out of the cabin, our eyes stinging from the transition to the morning sun. The silence of the landscape was no longer heavy with anticipation. It was hollow. We walked toward the site of the ambush. The ground was churned up, marked by the frantic struggle of the previous hours. Crates lay shattered across the rocks, their contents spilled out like refuse. Rifles, ammunition belts, and heavy packs were scattered in the dirt, abandoned in the chaos. A few mules stood nearby, tethered to a jagged outcrop, their heads low. Then, I saw them. The men were lined up, their hands bound behind their backs. They did not look at us. They did not look at the weapons we had seized. Their faces were drained of color, eyes fixed on the horizon as if they were already somewhere else. There was no defiance in their posture, only a profound, empty exhaustion. I walked past a pile of discarded gear, the metal cold and biting to the touch. This was the result of our hunt. It was not a victory of grand strategy, but a grim, static inventory of loss. The war had a face, and it was as empty as the morning air. Years drifted past, turning the sharp edges of that night into a dull, distant memory. I eventually learned the truth about those men. None of them survived the seasons that followed. The jagged, unforgiving rocks of Mount Cuddy had claimed them, writing a final, silent end to their story. We had broken a chain that night, severing a link that could never be mended. Yet, as the details of the operation faded, a different weight settled in. I found myself remembering love for the first time in an eternity. It was not a sudden epiphany, but a slow, creeping realization during the quietest hours of the night. I understood then that some people do not just leave. They carve out a space that remains empty, no matter how much time passes. The void they leave behind is a constant breathing presence. It haunts the silence of a room, the stillness of the air, and the rhythm of a life that continues to move forward. The war had its own casualties, measured in metal and blood, but the heart had its own separate tally. I stood in the quiet, listening to the wind, realizing that the most persistent ghosts are not the ones we hunt in the dark, but the ones we carry within ourselves.
I ask for your support. Together we will succeed. Subscribe now, like and comment. Thank you.